Welcome everybody. Now, if you watched my most recent video about the noon and 6 p.m. whistles that we have here in this small community, from the nearest town here at least, you may have remembered that I made a point of pointing out places where I would have gone off on little tangents about topics related to what I was talking about, but I didn't want to put them in that one because it ended up way too long. I mean, the thing was almost 30 minutes anyway, so yeah, I wanted to cut that down a little bit and keep it as short as I possibly could. So I pointed those places out, and I told you that I would make a video that was sort of an appendix to it, a sort of footnotes video to the video about the whistles. And that's what this is. So if you've seen that video, you probably at least have the context that you need to understand what I'm talking about here. Now don't worry, you don't really have to watch that video to understand this. I plan on giving you at least enough context for you to understand what's going on in these seemingly unrelated topics that I'm talking about. But anyway, let's begin. The scholarly dissection of the footnotes of the video about the noon and 6 p.m. whistles. So the first thing that I mentioned was related to the timing of them, why they did them at those times, why at noon and 6 p.m. And it was because of farmers and telling them what time the meals were. I mentioned lunch and dinner, noon and 6 p.m. But I mentioned that there was a point that I was going to make about that, and that is that those farmers, at least back in the 50s, probably not so much today, but back then when those were put in, those farmers in this region probably called those meals dinner and supper, respectively. It's a little strange, right? I mean, we all know the terms dinner and supper. For most of us, we consider them to be sort of synonyms for the evening meal. And that's at least largely true, but it's more complicated than that, because of course it is. It goes back a little bit into language history. Now, if you grew up in a city, or even probably out here in the last 20 or so years, maybe more, you probably never heard anybody call the midday meal dinner. It's weird, right? I mean, it's what we call the evening meal. But the thing is, they did. My grandparents, who were my dad's parents specifically, were farmers here in this county for most of their adult lives. For a good 34 years or something like that. They ran a farm, a dairy farm. And that's what they did. And they called them dinner and supper, respectively. At least early on, even after they sold the farm and retired when my parents moved with us to Los Angeles. And it would happen when we came back here for summers to stay with them. Suddenly the midday meal is dinner instead of lunch. It's weird. It's a form of what they call code switching, where you speak differently to different people. It was rural coded. We were rural coded, calling what rural farmer people called the midday meal. They called it dinner. And cool, you got used to it. I was young. I was adaptable. So it's weird. I had not thought about this in probably a long time before I made that video. And when I started talking about it and the farmers, and I was like, oh yeah, dinner and supper. That's right. But yeah, that's what it is. We tend to think of supper as sort of a rural coded thing too. It's quaint, it's old fashioned, it's rural. It's a synonym for the evening meal for dinner. But here's the thing. What if I told you that even maybe 300 years ago at the longest, just about everybody who spoke English at the time, which had been people throughout the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, probably most Irish too at that point, probably mostly spoke English. And the early colonists here in North America, and some of the islands in the Caribbean, here in the U.S., or what would become the U.S., and what would become Canada. it all been kind of established at that point, they would have all mostly called the noonday meal dinner and the evening meal supper. And weird, right? Because supper is a name for the evening meal. It is specifically for the evening meal. But dinner didn't mean that. It didn't mean any specific time. It meant the biggest meal of the day. And back 300 years ago, the vast majority of people were rural people, were farmers. You needed a lot of people to produce the food that you needed for your nation to survive. So, most people would be farming. It was all done basically by hand. You didn't have farm equipment. You didn't have tractors and things like that. You had a moldboard plow that you may have pushed yourself. Or if you were lucky, you had horse or oxen to pull it for you. But yeah, it was a lot of work, and before industrialization, and it's industrialization that causes the change. So all those farmers were working very strenuous physical labor all day. If you're taking care of livestock, especially like cattle for milk, you were getting up before the sunrise, and you were working for several hours before noon. So your noon meal had to be big. It had to be enough to keep you sustained, to replenish all those calories you've already burnt, and to give you the energy to keep going for the several hours that you're going to be working after this until almost dark. Or maybe even into dark. Before you had another meal at 6 o'clock. So generally that noon meal was your biggest meal of the day. So it was dinner. And that's what the biggest meal of the day was called. So yeah, they had that great big meal at noon. The advantage of making that happen also had something to do with the fact that if you're a farmer, you basically work from home. The place that you live is right there. So you could go in and have your big meal and then go back out and do your work for the rest of the day. Then industrialization begins to happen. People leave those farms, go to the city, some of them. Now, there's a trade-off here that part of industrialization is that it gives you things like the chilled steel plow, which is significantly better than an old moldboard plow. And it makes it easier to do. And eventually it gives you more and more. And more people leave to the city, more new things get invented, including equipment for farms where they can, have a tractor now. An actual thing instead of a beast, a burden to work their plows, to work their fields. And, it makes it a lot better and it makes it a lot more efficient, and less people farm every generation up until now. There's very few people who farm now. But, yeah. And we still produce plenty of food. But that's what ends up, causing it. Those people move to the city. Now, they're not necessarily doing a lot less physical labor. A lot of those early industrial jobs were just as labor-intensive and physical as the working on the farm was. But the difference is they're not doing it right by their home. They may be close, but they're usually not going home for a meal at midday. They're usually, and even if they are, they can't go home and have a great big one because they don't have the time to do it. You have a certain set amount of time to eat. And so it becomes that you're in the city, your biggest meal of the day is no longer at noon. And very soon it becomes the evening meal. And that evening meal no longer is called supper because it's the biggest meal of the day. You're calling it dinner. And as more and more people, the greater portion of the population, start moving to the city, dinner becomes the acceptable name for that evening meal. And you just have to invent a new one for the midday meal. You call it lunch. So that's what happened there. But it retained those old-fashioned names in rural places where people were farmers. So here, up until into my lifetime, my grandparents were still using it. So yeah, that's likely what those farmers that were being called in by the noon and 6 p.m. whistle were calling those meals that they were being called in for. They called them dinner and supper. So yeah, that's the first one. the Now next, I was talking about the ubiquity of those civil defense sirens that they used to do the noon and 6 p.m. whistles. And they were installed all over America during the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war was very real. This was the 50s. This was the era of the fallout shelter and the duck and cover drill and all of that. It was preeminent on people's minds, and they wanted to warn everybody. I mean, this little town here has 200 people in it. It wasn't significantly bigger in the 50s. It might have been even a little smaller. It was bigger in 1910, but it had shrunk down. The things had moved on, and people had moved to different centers of population around here, and so it was probably only as big as it is now, if not a bit smaller. And they put one there, so that tells you that they were putting them everywhere, anywhere that there was any kind of concentration of people. They wanted them to be able to know that this horrendous potential fate was going to be coming, so they could prepare at least. I don't know. It was a nutty time. I didn't live through it, but everything I've read, everything I've seen, it was pretty crazy. So yeah, they put those sirens in everywhere, and they had them in Los Angeles. I know that they had them in Los Angeles, even though I never heard them go off. And I know that they had them because of where I lived. There was one fairly nearby to where I lived most of the time that I lived in Los Angeles. Didn't notice it for a long time, but then something happened. So, let's set the story a little bit. This is the suburbs. It's a place called Chatsworth, California. But it is still part of the city of Los Angeles. It is the northwest incorporated spot in the city of Los Angeles. So our mayor is the mayor of Los Angeles. Our city council person is part of the Los Angeles City Council. We are still part of the city. But it's a suburban kind of bedroom community thing where you have big main streets, but then but those are mostly commercial, and all of your residences are off on side streets, little turnouts and cul-de-sacs and stuff to neatly carve it up into little lots for all the tract homes that all look more or less the same, the ones that were built at the same time at least, and basically the same floor plan, flipped around a little bit, slight details, variations. But yeah, that's what it was like. Now, the nearest main road to us was the main road that I went down to the last 3 public schools that I went to. The final elementary school for the last couple of years, the junior high school, which was later middle school. They did an alignment change and name change on that stuff not long after I graduated, kind of bring it in line with what with LAUSD, the Unified School District there in Los Angeles, to bring that in line with a lot of what the rest of the other school districts around the country were doing. And so they changed it to middle school, but it was junior high when I went there. So and the high school. They were all. I went down this same main road to all of them. One direction for the elementary school, and then the other direction for both the junior high and high school. And the elementary school was actually on the main road. It was actually on this intersection of that main road and another main road that was a freeway off-ramp exit, outlet. It was high traffic. It's a crazy place to put an elementary school, a bunch of little kids. But they had crossing guards and stuff, and I never really heard of anybody getting hurt or killed in accidents there. So I guess it worked. Kids in the city are warned about traffic, so they tend to be pretty good about it. So yeah, that was there. The other two, the middle school and high school, were not on that one main road. They were set back a little ways. The main road was all commercial. It was all businesses, gas stations, banks, stores, restaurants, things like that. And then there would be more stuff behind them. The residential areas would start in a lot of those places. Both of those schools were set back from that main road about 600 or so feet, by a very short block. The front of it on the main road, businesses. Behind that, condos. That's like the ultimate filler for spaces in the suburbs is condos. You need to give people affordable places to live, and that was the way to do it. So that's what you ended up having. So so that was what was there. So it was set back a little bit from that road. Now we're going to talk about the middle school here. The middle school is what's important to this story. It set back from that main road, but at that intersection, the road that you would turn down to go to it, at least from my direction, to get to the main entrance too. So really from everybody's direction, but there were other ways to get into the school in the morning. They would close them up afterward. Anyway, at that intersection, on the opposite side from the side where the school was, it would be the north side. The opposite side is the north, and the school is to the south. Anyway, on that north side, on that corner, there was a dairy, like a relic from the 50s, back from when milk delivery to the home was still a thing. You'd come to your house every morning and drop off bottles of milk on your doorstep. The milkman. This is a job that doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, it was a relic, but it had survived because there were hundreds of middle school kids, kids like 12 to 14 or whatever, maybe 15, going by every day, and there was a potential base of customers that they could have. So they made it basically a convenience store. They sold sodas, they sold candy, they sold snacks of all kinds. By the time I was there, they had arcade video games, the cabinet types, anything to get some money out of those kids, and it worked for them. They stayed in business for that whole time. But in the last about a year before I graduated, they took out the building opposite it, on the south side, the side where the school is. They took out the big building business, whatever it was there, I kind of forget. It was a long time ago. They took it out, and they built a very small little strip mall there. Little L-shaped thing, about 5 or 6 storefronts. And the very last storefront that was on that side, on the road, right at the road that you went down to the school, was an actual convenience store. Smaller space, probably a lower overhead, and either the people who own the dairy saw the writing on the wall, or their rent went up, or something like that. They sold out. It was done. The dairy was done. It was an old building from probably the 50s or earlier, and it wasn't what they wanted to have there for the new thing, so they leveled it. They put up a chain link fence around the property and a sign that showed what they were going to build there. But they just so happened that at that time there was a sort of downturn in real estate in the LA area, and the thing that they planned to build there never got built. And that piece of land on that corner stayed empty for a year or so. And suddenly, without the building there, and the signs, and all the other stuff that was there, suddenly you could see behind it. And you could see that there was this thing there. It looked like a big megaphone on a pole. And it was the civil defense siren for that area. It was close. I mentioned in the other video that the one that you hear in that video doing the noon whistle is just over a mile away from my house here. Where I lived there to where that siren is less than a half mile. Inverse square would tell me that thing would have been 4 times as loud. However, it also would have been scattered by a lot of buildings and other structures in there, so you would have had some loss, but it probably still would have been at least as loud as this. I don't think it would lose more than 3/4 of its volume just from all that scattering. I doubt it. So if it had gone off, you would have heard it. But you just didn't see them around there, or you didn't notice them because there were so many buildings, there were so many power poles and telephone poles, and signs and billboards and all kinds of stuff in the way. And if they were visible, you just didn't really notice them amongst all the clutter. But when they took that building down, you'd notice them. Eventually, they did build something there, and they've torn that down since too. And they built an IHOP there. I can't imagine that gets a lot of traffic from the middle school kids. Maybe the more well-off ones. Maybe they walk in more than a half hour early and go eat breakfast at IHOP before they go to school. I don't know. Seems like pain to me. But, you know, maybe they do. I don't know. Anyway, but it's obviously working. You know, they do site surveys for those things before they put them in. They wouldn't put them in some place that they didn't think that they were going to make money, and obviously it's still open, so must be doing some decent business. But yeah, it's there. And I looked on, you know, on Google Street View and stuff, and looked, and I don't see where the siren is. They probably tore it out at that point. They never used them there. And here's where the next note comes in. It's about the various disasters that they have there, the various things that they could warn you about with those sirens that they just don't. You know, sometimes because they can't, you know, it doesn't fit, and sometimes because, you know, they just don't bother to use them. They use emergency broadcast back then, now emergency alert system now. You know, they've gone in heavy on that, and they seem to have abandoned the idea of the civil defense siren as a warning system. So, you know, they just sort of sit there disused until somebody decides to tear them down. Yeah, because, you know, they don't have tornadoes there. They don't need to warn you about those, but they do have wildfires, and I mentioned that in the other video. There were some close by us, but, you know, never a siren went off. There are mudslides. Never heard a siren for those. Then the other thing that they have are earthquakes, and you don't get advance warning on earthquakes, so a siren wouldn't be all that useful anyway. And they really don't need to do it during the earthquake because, well, you are very aware if an earthquake is close by, and it's dangerous, you know, of a strong enough level to be a danger. You're very aware. Your whole world is shaking. You very quickly realize what's going on. It's an earthquake. So adding sirens to that would just add to confusion. But yeah, I mentioned there that I lived through the Northridge quake. On January 17th, 1994, at 4:31 a.m., there was a 6.7 earthquake in the San Fernando Valley. I lived in Chatsworth, it's just in the San Fernando Valley. This is in Northridge, which is right next door. I did a Google map thing on this too. It was about 4.9 miles from the epicenter is where I lived. Close. Very close. Very, very strong. 6.7. I mean, there's a lot stronger earthquakes on record. You know, this is a Good Friday earthquake in Alaska. That was huge. But this is plenty strong. You lived through one. Tell me what you think. No, I wouldn't actually wish that on anybody. I wouldn't wish anybody to live through an earthquake. It's bad. It's very frightening. There are things that they warn you about, especially if you live there in LA, because, you know, the place is prone to earthquakes. So there are things that they warn you about with them. You know, they warn you about the initial shock and all the damage that it can do, and get in a doorway. It's the sturdiest part of your house. It'll probably survive the longest, you know. Good luck. But, and they also tell you about aftershocks. Aftershocks happen after the earthquake, hence the name. Usually lesser intensity, lesser magnitude, shorter duration than the initial earthquake. But they can be as big or bigger. And they tell you that. So you're kind of prepared for that, and they happen in a certain time frame around the earthquake. They become less and less likely as time goes by. But what they don't tell you, what I never heard of, even from people who lived through the Selmar quake, which is also in the San Fernando Valley, you know, 20-ish years earlier, 22 years earlier, 23, something like that. They never really told you, and they never really told me at least, about the other after effect, which is, since the ground was all upheaved by this earthquake, it has to sort of settle back down and find its new equilibrium. So, for the next couple of weeks at least, every 15 to 30 minutes you will get a very minor shake, just a little bit, just enough to feel. And it's very unsettling. It's incredibly unsettling because it happens so often. But eventually you kind of get used to it. Except that sometimes you will have one of those little minor shakes. It's not enough to knock everything over or cause any damage, anything. It's just enough for you to feel it and unsettle you. But once you get used to it, you're generally used to it, except when it just so happens to coincide with a significant aftershock. And then you're scared again. You're right back where you were when the initial shock happened, and it's incredibly unsettling. It's like I said, I don't wish it on anybody. I don't wish anybody to have to live through one. The one was enough, but it is something that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was quite an experience. So yeah. So that's the other point. Now the last one that I was going to mention had to do with the inspiration for the video. A YouTuber named Scott Kramer made a video about small town summer festivals where he encountered a probably 6 o'clock whistle, and he had to make a note of it because he wasn't used to those kind of things. And yeah, that's what it's like. But it's a very good thing. Now I'm not going to make a whole video on them here. His video is pretty darn good about the subject. It covers it quite well. You should watch it. Good video. But I am going to talk a little bit about them around here. I mentioned in that video that towns of a significant enough size to do and have summer festivals pretty much everywhere across the U.S. It's a weekend thing that happens. They're usually named something like insert name of town here, days. And it's a very straightforward name. It gets to the point. It does the job. It's not super creative, but it tells you what you need to know. So yeah, that's usually what they are. But there are exceptions. We'll get to that. This nearest town I mentioned has like 200 people in it. It's just not big enough to support one of these festivals. You need people to work attractions. You need people to participate in attractions. You need people for a parade to run through, to run their vehicles through the parade. You need people to watch. You need, spectators. You need people to run booths to sell food. You need and trinkets and whatever else. And you need people that are going to go to those things and pay to get the food or the trinkets. So yeah, it's just 200 is just not enough. They also don't have the businesses to do that. It's a tiny place. There's only one really traditional business. There's a bar that sells beer and wine, but no hard liquor. Other than that, they have a post office. That's the closest thing to another business, but that's not a really for-profit business. It's a government thing, and yeah, so that's what they have. Besides those, they have a couple of churches, a volunteer fire department building, and as far as non-residences go, and a very small park between the volunteer fire department building and the bar that serves beer and wine, but no hard liquor. By the way, just a little side note to the side note here. It's probably because of the time of year, but using that same phrasing twice like that reminds me of Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant Massacre. We're not very far from Thanksgiving, and I happened to hear it during that, and where he repeats over and over again the thing about the 27 8x10 color glossy photos with circles and arrows and a paragraph on the back to be used as evidence against us. And he does it over and over again in the song, and that's what it reminds me of. So, but it's probably just because it's that time of year. If I'd done this in July, I probably wouldn't even be thinking of that. But yeah, so they just don't have the support to have one, so they don't. Now I mentioned that most of them go by the insert name of town here days thing, but some don't. Some go by come up with their own name, oftentimes based on a crop that is grown specifically in that region. Around here it's mostly just soybeans and corn, and everybody grows it all around. So you wouldn't call it your soybean or corn festival or something like that, because that doesn't differentiate you from any place else. It also could be named for a product that you make in that town. And I mentioned the next nearest town to here, which also has a siren, or a noon whistle thing, but that town is 10 times the population. Big, for a small town, pretty big, 2,000 people. It has a lot of things you think of with a town. It has a couple banks, it has a couple gas stations, it has grocery store, pharmacy, 2 different types of dollar stores, fast food places, restaurants where you can dine in, all the stuff you think of when you think of a town. But still small. It only has one stoplight. It's pretty small still. But they definitely have the population and the business support to make the summer festival happen. And in that town, they go by the alternate name, and they do it from a product that they make in that town. They happen to make bologna in that town. And so their summer festival is called the Bologna Festival. Their bologna there is regionally famous here in the thumb of Michigan. It is sold in basically every grocery store here. It is a popular product. They make it various different types. They make ring bologna that's like a kielbasa. They make pickled bologna, which, not my thing. You can have mine, thanks. But, people like it, and, more power to them. Again, they can have my share. It's just not my thing. I've tried it. Don't like it. So, yeah, they make bologna there. And they have their Bologna Festival, which is just a fantastic name for your summer festival. Just think about that. Hey, man, what are you going to do this weekend? Oh, I'm going to the Bologna Festival. If you don't want to hang out with me, you don't have to lie and make up stupid names for things. Seriously, man, I'm going to the Bologna Festival. It's going to be a good time. You should come. Jeez, you're awfully defensive about the fact that I'm trying to ditch you or something. Man. But anyway, yeah, the Bologna Festival. Good time. It's fun to go to. The activities are cool. It's not so great if you have business in that town that weekend, or you have to go through that town if it's on the way, it's on a main road for that city. And all these towns are going to shut down their main road because that's where they're doing their parade, all their attractions. It's going to be shut down for that weekend. You better find an alternate route. So cool. But all in all, it's a good time, and it's something for people in rural America to do during the summer. Something to look forward to. Way to have some fun. So that's why they exist. So anyway, that's it. These are all your footnotes for the Siren video. Now you're up to date on my thought processes about how I go off on tangents about things that are brought to mind by something as simple as why is there a noon whistle. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I thank you all for watching. And you can do all the things down below that you want. You have a summer festival, if you've lived in rural America anywhere, you can talk about that down there in the comments. You can like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, do whatever you want down there. But, thank you for watching, and I hope you all have the best possible day that you can have, and I will see you soon. Take care.